Well, as you'll be aware from previous episodes of McBLOG, Victoria University in Wellington appears to be rebranding paedophiles as victims of stigma, whose only guilt is having a sexual preference or orientation. But this is what is called the separability and manipulability of the verbal label. Let's check it out. So when we talk about the separability and manipulability of the English language or the verbal, what it's saying is that language matters. And as campaigners admitted in the book After the Ball by Marshall Kirk and Hunter Madsen, a book from 1990 that explained how the whole LGBTQ++ movement could be normalised, and look, they've done an amazing job, they say this: we can actually change what people think and feel by breaking their current negative association with our cause and replacing them with positive associations. And it's not just in the LGBT space that this technique has been used. For example, pro-abortion is now pro-choice, although not for the child, of course. And of course now it's reproductive health, although actually the ability to get pregnant was your reproductive health, not killing the consequence of that. Euthanasia or assisted suicide, we don't hear those terms, it's death with dignity or end-of-life choice. Prostitution is called sex work. Gambling is called gaming. Chemicalising and castrating young people who are confused about their gender is called gender affirmation. Exposing and grooming very young children with sexually explicit material and telling them myths such as you can change your sex is called relationships and sexuality education, RSE. We would call it a perverting of the young mind. The list goes on. But you get the picture, eh? What they're doing is changing the negative connotation to a positive one to get people on side. And most disturbingly, in our hedonistic and narcissistic sexualised culture, there's a disturbing effort to normalise pedophilia, a sexual attraction to children, which actually dates its way back to Alfred Kinsey. As you can imagine, it's a recipe for disaster. The movement is even going so far as to claim that pedophilia should be understood as a sexual orientation. The goal is to remove the stigma from non-offending pedophiles. But the danger is that trying to destigmatise morally eroded behaviour generally ends up normalising it. Now, just to note some definitions, according to psychologytoday.com, I showed you this in the last episode, hebephilia is a sexual preference for children in early adolescence between ages 11 and 14. Pedophilia is marked by a sexual preference for prepubescent children, rather than those who have finished puberty and entered adolescence. And ephebophilia, is that how you say it? Refers to an attraction for older adolescents around 15 to 18 years old. And according to Wikipedia, which as I've said is not exactly the source of moral conservatism, it says that pedophilia is a psychiatric disorder in which an adult or older adolescent experiences a primary or exclusive sexual attraction to prepubescent children. People with the disorder are often referred to as pedophiles. Well, it's still sexual abuse of children. That's all you need to know. And I've put the little tomato image there sort of to remind you that, tomato, how do you say it? Look, all those terms are all the same thing. They're child sexual abuse. And we generally put them under the general label paedophilia, which isn't wrong. Now, one of the leaders in this movement is an organisation called Prostasia Foundation. It advocates for replacing the word pedophile with minor attracted person, or MAP. Prostasia, based in San Francisco, no surprise there, label themselves as a new kind of child protection organisation, and they say that they aim to reduce child sexual abuse by taking away the shame of being attracted to a minor, thereby reducing the likelihood of someone acting out on their desires. But in this tweet from 2019, they say, we are a new child protection organisation that is inclusive of LGBTQ people, kinky people and sex workers, and includes them in leadership. Now, they also support the use and sale of sex dolls that look like children, porn that simulates sex with a minor, and funding research into fantasy sexual outlets for pedophiles. And the argument that normalising it reduces the crime? Yeah, no, it doesn't ring true, does it? Now, an assistant professor at a Virginia university recently caused a storm by suggesting that it isn't necessarily immoral for adults to be sexually attracted to children. Alan Walker, who taught sociology and criminal justice at Old Dominion University in the US, made the comment while discussing minor attracted persons and pedophiles during an interview with the Prostasia Foundation. And Walker, who identifies as they, them, because obviously, like Green MP Darlene Tana, they never walk alone, she was discussing her book entitled A Long Dark Shadow, Minor Attracted People and Their Pursuit of Dignity. And she insisted it's important to use that terminology instead of pedophile because it's less stigmatising. And you'll hear the mention of the radical group Before You Act, which I'll come back to. Have a watch.
I use the term minor attracted person, or MAP, in the title and throughout the book for multiple reasons. First of all, because I think it's important to use terminology for groups that members of that group want others to use for them. And MAP advocacy groups like Before You Act have advocated for use of the term MAP. They've advocated for it primarily because it's less stigmatizing than other terms like pedophile. A lot of people, when they hear the term pedophile, they automatically assume that it means a sex offender. And that isn't true, and it leads to a lot of misconceptions about attractions toward minors. I've definitely heard the idea that you brought up, though, that the use of the term minor attracted person suggests that it's okay to be attracted to children. But using a term that communicates who someone is attracted to doesn't indicate anything about the morality of that attraction.
Yeah. Now, she correctly identifies Before You Act as the originator of this sanitised term for pedophiles, which was founded in 2003. It's an organisation of psychiatrists and other mental health professionals, many who teach at prestigious universities, dedicated to the proposition that MAPs, minor attracted persons, who are almost all men, are seriously misunderstood and suffer from being stigmatised by the rest of us. And Before You Act believes that pedophilia is not a sexual disorder, rather it's a sexual orientation, much like homosexuality. And its members take umbrage at the notion that MAPs are mentally disturbed, and some argue that it is nonsense to say that children are unable to consent to sex with adults. As one of their leaders put it, an adult's desire to have sex with children is normative. And then in 2011, according to a report by the Daily Caller, a small group of psychiatrists and other mental health professionals wanted to remove pedophilia from the American Psychiatric Association's Bible of Mental Illnesses, the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And it was set to undergo a significant revision in 2013. So they held a conference in 2011, sponsored by Before You Act. The good news is that pedophilia is still a mental disorder and is still in the DSM. Now, child advocate Dr. Judith Reisman and author of Sexual Sabotage, which takes a critical look at the work of biologist Alfred Kinsey, said that this conference was part of a strategy to condition people into accepting pedophiles. She said, quote, "The first thing they do is get the public to divest from thinking of what the offender does criminally to thinking of the offender's emotional state, to think of him as thinking of his emotional state, and to empathise and sympathise. You don't change the nation in one fell swoop, you have to change it by conditioning. The aim is to get the pedophiles out of prison." End quote. Now, according to Reisman, empirical data shows that pedophiles typically molest many children before finally being caught. And she said, quote, "The data on paroled pedophiles confirms these predators repeat their crimes against children and are known to have escalated them even to murder." And then in 2018, Mirjam Hein, a German medical student at the University of Würzburg in Germany, made a pretty disturbing talk at a TEDx talk. It was entitled, "Why Perception of Pedophilia Has to Change." And she claimed that according to current research, pedophilia is an unchangeable sexual orientation, just like, for example, heterosexuality. And no one chooses to be a pedophile. No one can cease being one. Have a watch.
But just like pedophiles, we are not responsible for our feelings. We do not choose them. But we are responsible for our actions. And we must make a decision. It is in our responsibility to reflect and to overcome our negative feelings about pedophiles and to treat them with the same respect we treat other people with.
Yeah, okay. And she continued.
We should accept that pedophiles are people who have not chosen their sexuality and who, unlike most of us, will never be able to live it out freely if they want to lead an upright life. We should accept that pedophilia is a sexual preference, a thought, a feeling, and not an act. We should differentiate between child sexual abuse and pedophilia. We shouldn't increase the suffering of pedophiles by excluding them, by blaming and mocking them.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it doesn't get any better, I'm sorry to say. In January of this year, USA Today, one of the nation's most widely circulated newspapers, ran an article that presented pedophilia as, quote, among the most misunderstood condition in American society. Diminishing pedophilia is just inappropriate, while it promoted destigmatizing the attraction. It said, quote, pedophilia is viewed as among the most horrifying social ills, but scientists who study the sexual disorder say it is also among the most misunderstood. Researchers who study pedophilia say the term describes an attraction, not an action, and using it interchangeably with abuse fuels misperceptions about pedophiles. And then, in yet another example, videos emerged of a State University of New York professor defending pedophilia and insisting it wasn't obvious to him why it was wrong. Now, there's a number of videos in different settings, but there was video clips from the end of 2020, which featured Professor Stephen Kirshner of the State University of New York and a podcaster. And the podcaster is on the right, Dr. Stephen is on the left, and the two professors are laughing about the subject of adult child sex. Have a watch.
Child sex, that's always a big seller.
Oh, yeah. Well,
I had good friends who said, "Are you crazy? Do not write that book."
man, listen, you're talking to a guy who for 25 years has been making arguments more or less in defense of adult child sex in classrooms. And I don't know if it's the same argument as yours, but I even authored a piece in the Daily Beast in which I called into question the age of consent laws. Which is, and I brought to bear the arguments I was making in class, and I'm going to see whether they jive.
Yep, and also this one.
This seems to be like a paradigm case. There's actually some meta studies which seem to suggest that in some cases, at least with regard to adult males and underage males, that it's not harmful, or if it is harmful, we can't decide whether the harm is due to the sex itself or the fact that society goes berserk over it. And so one of the articles I was reading said, look, this is wrong. We don't need to know whether it's harmful. The empirical question of whether or not there's any long-term harm we can track on this is really beside the point. And I was kind of struck with the question. I thought, well, it's not obvious to me why that is. Right? I mean, the standard kind of other argument is that it's a right infringement, and I wasn't sort of convinced by that argument. And also when it comes to pedophilia rather than sort of adult child sex, so sex with like young teens, it's not clear to me. I mean, look, there's at least some reason to believe that that individuals are, designed by evolution to begin reproduction at that period. So if they're designed by evolution to begin reproduction, it's not clear why it would be physically either harmful or emotionally harmful. And so there was kind of like three different explanations, none of which convinced me.
Yeah, and just finally, this atrocious bit where they compare pedophilia and child sexual abuse with going to church.
Infringement case that we don't get, they can't give their valid consent and therefore it's wrong in virtue of being a right infringement. And there's a view that it's exploitative, that even if it's not harmful,
Yes.
even if it's not a right infringement, it's somehow an exploitation.
I've heard all these. Yes. Okay.
Right. So those are the three dominant arguments. And none of these convince me. So
Me neither.
the harm argument, well, there's actual empirical controversy over this.
Sure. Yeah.
On the rights-based argument, I think, look, we make children do all sorts of things that we don't want to do. Right?
Thank you.
We make them go to church. We make them go to the temple. We tell them to go to school. They got to go to the dentist. They got to go to their sister's ballet recital. And we don't care what they say. And they want to do things. We say no, right? They say, I want to stay up and watch, Creature Feature on WPIX until, 2 in the morning. We say, well, it's tough.
That is all a child's life is coercion.
Right, that's right.
Is coercion by adults often to make the child do something for the adult's pleasure only.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
You say, you're going to go to your great uncle's funeral, even though you want to go, and even though it's not in your interest.
Right.
So the rights-based argument's a little bit hard to follow.
Yeah, that was painful, wasn't it? And in an interview just 3 months ago, the godmother of queer theory, Judith Butler, said that her work makes it easier for pedophiles and the indoctrination of minors into gender and sex ideologies. She was promoting her new book, Who's Afraid of Gender? And within the first 5 minutes of this interview, she basically attacks are made against her work and against the natural family and against male, female as God created us. And you'll hear her, she admits that it makes it easier for people with all sorts of alternative desires, including pedophilia, to live out their desires publicly.
Afraid that this feminist biologist was introducing the notion of 5 genders, so the idea that gender could in any way multiply beyond the usual 2 was very worrisome for them for complex reasons having to do with their idea of God creating male and female and God creating the human form in a necessary duality of male and female, right? So there is no human if there is no male and female. If you go beyond that or you go against it, you've destroyed the human, which they claim gender has done. So, but there are parts of the world where I became identified with gender theory, in France, la théorie du genre, and then in parts of Latin America where I was identified as representing gender ideology and a threat to children. My work would indoctrinate them, or my work would license pedophilia,
What?
or my work and the work of gender more broadly would teach them how to become homosexual or teach them that they must become homosexual. Which is
Kind of true.
kind of wild.
Hilarious.
Kind of works, yeah.
Talk about where the wild things are.
Oh,
But, well, of course, we know Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick said, yes, we do teach that, and that is one answer, if that is your desire and you're looking for ways to live according to that desire, come along and we'll make that easier for you. But
charming. Now, Indiana University erected a sculpture of a sex researcher who was accused of defending pedophilia and child sex abuse. Alfred C. Kinsey, know that name, studied the sexual behaviours of adults and minors and founded a leading sexuality research institute in 1947, and it was at this university. They announced that a sculpture memorialising Kinsey and his enduring contributions was installed at the Institute, the Kinsey's original site. And the executive director of the Kinsey Institute said in the announcement that the statue demonstrates the school's ongoing commitment to equity regarding sexual diversity. Kinsey joined Indiana University's faculty in 1920, where he gathered the sex histories of individuals for research. He published 2 books on the sexual behaviour of males and females and appears to have had a perverse view of child sexuality. And he argued in his work that children who are used for adult gratification are not being abused. He appeared to believe that adults who manipulate children sexually are only helping the child find his or her own authentic and autonomous sexuality. That's according to British sociologist Sarah Good. He did not believe that sex offenders or pedophiles existed, and reportedly did not believe that sex offenders should be held criminally liable. And just finally, you've probably had enough already, but it does show you just how deeply entrenched this has been for quite a long time. And Wellington is just, Victoria University is really just joining this grand, awful train in motion. In March last year, historian Rachel Hope Cleves described pedophilia as intergenerational sex, adding that she wouldn't describe the abuse of children with words such as survivors or necessarily abuse. She wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post around the same time that argued against Republicans wanting to ban drag shows, because apparently Republicans wanted to reinforce traditional hierarchies of race, class, sex and gender. No, actually we just want to protect children. But she wrote her biography of British author Norman Douglas a couple of years before that, who was charged multiple times with rape and sexual assault of underage boys and girls. And Professor Rachel Hope Cleves described pedophilia as intergenerational sex. Have a short watch.
Late 19th century, they referred to them as a pederasty, which had its own set of connotations. So in writing this book, I didn't want to use pedophile discourse because I felt like it would fail to capture this other historical organizing system for intergenerational sex, which was the topic that I wanted to address. I just felt like contemporary language would have made it impossible, really, for us to reckon with this prior historical system. So I do talk about intergenerational sex. This is to get to this terminology question. This is a contentious term because I think by the standards of our time, we don't see any possibility for sex between adults and children. We see it as rape, right? And not falling within the framework of sex or sexuality. I don't use the discourse of survivors or necessarily abuse to make sense of the sources.
Now, as Focus on the Family rightly points out, we need to keep in mind that pedophiles and perpetrators of sexual abuse share several distinct personality traits. They're usually seductive, manipulative, and highly controlling. But they're also nice, friendly, helpful, and extremely good at charming their way into other people's good graces. That way they can persuade those same people to do what they want them to do. Exodus Cry, an organisation that opposes sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, sums it up well in my view. They say, quote, "While we absolutely believe that there should be appropriate and improved avenues for pedophiles to seek help and therapy, the approach of normalising and destigmatising sexual attraction to children is severely misguided. In what world does normalising the idea of a criminal act prevent that act from happening?" Good question. And Associate Professor of Criminology, Michael Salter, in the University of New South Wales, so Australian, he tweeted this: "Sometimes stigma is good, some things should be stigmatised," but then he says, "The compulsion to abuse children is not a morally neutral one, and it should be stigmatised, i.e. attract social disapproval." Now, the good news is that pedophilia can be treated with hormone, medication therapies, cognitive behaviour therapy, and psychosocial methods such as group therapy. Testosterone-lowering drugs have also shown positive results in reducing sexual interests and behaviours. We should definitely increase support for men who want help, and those small amount of women as well. But don't allow the culture to play linguistic gymnastics with the term paedophile. Academics overseas, and now even here in Victoria University and also Auckland and Massey universities, are guilty of reducing and even minimising the horrific harm and damage to the child and giving false elevation and a dangerous status of victimhood to the paedophile. The stigma is there for a good reason. It's a healthy stigma, which hopefully redirects the offender. But more importantly, the stigma is there to try and protect the victim, the child, and that's where our focus should be. Now, in our next episode, we'll continue our journey with Victoria University as they try to indoctrinate me to think the way they do. Stay tuned.